Hi, I'm Erik Voss, and let's talk about this amazing, but also at times totally bewildering first season of the series Legion on FX. Now, I know that many of you have been asking for me to go pick back up with these episode breakdowns since I left off on episode 3, but I have finally returned to talk about the rest of the season because there is still so much to discuss, tons of missable details and hidden meaning, and some mysteries that are still kind of mysteries. So I'm going to do my best to explain any confusion that you still might have and just some cool connections that I found. And if you haven't seen any of my Legion videos before, you really should go back to watch my breakdowns of episodes 1, 2, and 3. I go super in depth in those, and a lot of my theories turned out to be right. Some were wrong, we won't talk about those. Meanwhile, since then, I did discover a few more connections in those first 3 episodes that I'll get to in this video. And I really shouldn't have to say it, but spoiler warning if you haven't watched through the Legion season finale, episode 8. But if you have watched that far, you'll know that this season did answer a lot of the big questions that we had starting in that first episode. Most importantly, the devil with the yellow eyes, it turns out, is the Shadow King from the X-Men comics. Now, I went a bit into his backstory in my episode 2 breakdown, but the Shadow King is Amal Farouk, one of the oldest and most powerful mutants. He's actually the first evil mutant met by Charles Xavier, and he inspired him to create the X-Men. The Shadow King basically represents the dark side of the human consciousness, and he was spawned by the very first Nightmare. He feeds off of other psychic mutants and possesses the bodies of other humans. He battled Charles Xavier and later his son, David Haller, Legion, leaving him in a coma. Now, in the show Legion, Farouk is a parasite that embedded himself inside David's mind as a baby, taking several forms over the years. Of course, there's the devil with the yellow eyes, but also Lenny, Aubrey Plaza's character, a female manifestation of the Shadow King that he inserted into David's past memories to replace a real man named Benny. The Shadow King also takes the form of this creepy, angriest boy in the world figure, as well as David's childhood dog, King, whom we learn later in the season only existed in David's mind. Carrie actually realizes in episode 7 that the name King is a reference to the Shadow King.
The dog! In David's memories, he's disguised himself as a really very cute little beagle, but the name King, Amal Farouk.
And in my breakdowns, I pointed out a few of the show's clues about the Shadow King. For example, the devil with the yellow eyes appears as a toy in the opening seconds of the pilot episode, and Lenny is sneakily depicted as a demonic presence haunting David in a mirror. Also, the devil with the yellow eyes and the angriest boy wear similar clothes, and they appear to be interchangeable when they chase Sydney and David through his memories in episode 3. And Lenny suddenly transforms into the devil with the yellow eyes more than once. And it turns out my paranoia over seeing eyes everywhere in episode 2 was justified. Those graffiti eyes that showed up in frame when David and Lenny were together later evolve into the Shadow King's actual eyes as he watches people inside the mental version of Clockworks. But then upon rewatching those first 3 episodes, I noticed a few more that I didn't point out. And a lot of it has to do with the color red, which I pointed out before as a color that the show used to suggest danger. But more specifically, red is used to show the Shadow King's corruptive influence. So for example, during that amazing Bollywood dance number in the first episode, Lenny is shown wearing red, giggling devilishly as she dances by herself. It's like she's operating all of these other dancing mental patients like puppets, hinting how she will later control the version of Clockworks in David's mind, again, dancing in celebration that episode. Also, in the opening images of episode 3, King is seen repeatedly fetching this red tennis ball. Later that episode, when King runs off in the Halloween memory, the dog transforms into the terrifying, angriest boy in the world. Again, the association with the color red was an important clue there. But let's move on to chapter 4, an episode where David meets Oliver, Melanie's husband, played by the awesome Jermaine Clement. This episode is all about the power of storytelling, and it opens with this great, long-take prologue from Oliver. He starts by quoting the German philosopher Nietzsche.
In times of peace, the warlike man attacks himself.
He's alluding to the inner struggle David is fighting against the Shadow King inside his mind. Oliver then explains the 2 types of stories that we tell our children. One's about fuzzy little bunnies to teach empathy, and warnings to stay away from the ocean to teach fear. And then he makes this promise.
And so I bring you tonight's play. A work in 5 acts about a fuzzy little bunny. who got too close to the ocean.
And the episode that comes after that delivers on that promise, with Sydney as the fuzzy bunny that we feel empathy for, but also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of curiosity, which, if you remember, is exactly the same theme from Oliver's story about the woodcutter and the crane. And then this story is broken down into 5 acts. Act 1, Sydney investigates Dr. Poole's office, learning that David's memories are unreliable and that he has a history of violence. Act 2, Amy reveals that David never had a dog, suggesting that his condition goes back to a young age. Act 3, David meets Oliver in the astral plane, where we saw the Shadow King, Devil with the Yellow Eyes, as a dangerous monster haunting David inside his own mind. Act 4, Sydney meets David's ex-girlfriend, who reveals that Lenny was actually Benny in real life. And then that leads them to Dr. Poole's lighthouse, where in Act 5, Dr. Poole's different colored eye reveals him as the Eye, Walter, who attacks them, leading Shadow King Lenny to exploit the situation into getting David to hand over control to her. I'm also thinking that the 5 acts that Oliver references could refer to the remaining 5 episodes of the season, 4 through 8, with the first 3 episodes kind of serving as a prologue to David's story, and then Oliver not really interpreting the story as beginning until he enters it. It's also interesting that Oliver brings up this ocean imagery, because that's a big part of this episode. It actually connects to that question that Sydney keeps asking, which never really gets firmly answered.
What did the stars say? What did the stars say?
So Sydney here is referring to the constellations that David repeats during his session with Dr. Poole, which he learned from stargazing with his foster dad. So Andromeda and Cassiopeia are constellations named after figures from Greek mythology. Now again, this episode is about storytelling, so naturally it references some of the most ancient and famous stories in human history. Andromeda was known as the Chained Woman. Her father and mother, her mother's name Cassiopeia, chained her to rocks by the sea to appease a monster sent by Poseidon to destroy them. She was later saved by the hero Perseus. And by the way, this whole Greek myth is part of Ovid's narrative poem, The Metamorphosis, which is the same name of the jazz song that Oliver plays later this episode. So all this sea imagery serves as the cautionary part of the tale, the one that teaches fear. Go too close to the ocean and you might drown. So of course, where do Sydney and the others run into the greatest danger? The lighthouse by the sea. So that, to answer Sydney's questions, is what the stars say. They tell these ancient stories that teach us empathy and fear. And David repeats these constellation names to Dr. Poole as a way to tell himself stories to distort his own narrative, hiding the truth about the parasitic presence in his mind, which is trying to cover its tracks with these new false memories. Also, I like how David name drops the constellations Canis Major and Lupus. Those are, respectively, the dog and the wolf, which are both things that appear in this episode. The dog, King, and the wolf, which shows up as this new taxidermy in Summerland. Some of you also notice this recurring image of the chain, the ladder that David climbs into Oliver's lounge, plus David's ex-girlfriend's earrings and Carrie's belt. So other than yet another visual reference to the chains of Andromeda, all these chains represent the symbolic shackles that bind David. He's constantly weighed down by his own yellow-eyed ball and chain. And one other thing I liked in this episode before I move on, look at the sign that the truck crashes into. It says uncertainty ahead. So this is a fun meta joke by the show. David caused this truck to swerve without realizing that Sydney had swapped bodies with Walter and that she was escaping with their friends. Of course, this was all a trick by Shadow King Lenny to get influence over David and bring harm to the rival influences over him, Sydney and the other mutants. And that uncertainty is what David really needed to be cautious about. Too bad he missed the sign. Okay, moving on to episode 5. And if you notice, David is acting differently this episode. It's because this isn't David. After waking up from his coma, he has allowed the Shadow King to take the wheel. That's why David's creepy smile, his tics and gestures, and his new assertiveness all seem like Dan Stevens is doing an impression of Aubrey Plaza as Lenny. And this episode drops a few interesting clues. One, David changes his shirt into this yellow triangle design. It kind of looks like an elevator up call button. As if the devil with the yellow eyes, the Shadow King has taken the elevator up to the surface of David's consciousness. We actually see David and Sydney taking an elevator together, with the transition opening up like elevator doors into this mental hotel room that David created for them to have sex in. But really, all this aggressive behavior stems from the Shadow King's control of David in this episode. Another clue that this place is too good to be true is the bowl of strawberries that's covered in bugs. Of course, this is a red flag of the Shadow King's actual toxic influence in David's mind. And notice how this shot transitions to another red image, the bleeding gunshot wound on Carrie's shoulder. This is suggesting that this seemingly perfect hotel room actually has a bleeding, festering wound from the Shadow King's presence. And notice how when Sydney confesses to David the time when she had sex with her mother's boyfriend while swapped into her mother's body, David has this incredulous look on his face, because that's exactly what the Shadow King is doing to him right now, falsely commandeering his body to have sex with someone else. And as we've seen before in the show, this scene transitions from blue light, the color where David and Sydney feel safe together, to red light, a place where David is being threatened, often by the Shadow King in his mind. And notice how Lenny rhythmically pounds the ball against the wall.
I mean, we can bring him as cannon fodder, but they're just gonna slow us down.
Foreshadowing the rhythmic tapping of the ping pong ball in Clockworks at the end of this episode. Now, when they catch up to this mess of bodies that David left at Division 3, this music is Radiohead's The Daily Mail. It's interpreted as the band's criticism against the British tabloid, The Daily Mail, where they believe the lunatics have taken over the asylum and feed the little guy to the hounds. This, of course, corresponds to David's situation, where a lunatic, the Shadow King, has taken over the asylum in his head, which literally transforms into an asylum at the end of this episode. But of course, all this carnage wasn't done by David, but the Shadow King. The security videos show David prancing around the facility, similar to how Lenny would move. And of course, we see the devil with the yellow eyes in one of the monitors. And then, as the old man in charge dies, he utters these terrifying final words.
It wears a human face.
I like how David calls back this line later in this episode, tugging on his face as he looks in the mirror. And now that we know David has a big reason to be scared, the second song in this episode is performed by David himself, very creeped out, The Rainbow Connection.
Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection. The lovers, the dreamers, and me.
So obviously this is a nod to Kermit the Frog. David even plays the banjo with his legs up, kind of similar to how Kermit looks. But it's also a callback to the Rolling Stones song, She's a Rainbow, from the first episode.
She's like a rainbow, coming colors in the air.
In both cases, these songs about rainbows suggest that a rainbow being an illusion gives it a mysterious quality. Like, it's beautiful, but it isn't actually real. Similarly, this pretty color-shifting reality that David has created in this room is an illusion, a cover for something more sinister. And when David uses the words of the song to warn Sydney about what's on the other side of the door, she sees the Dog King, who quickly transforms in the mirror to the angriest boys, since both of them are the Shadow King in different forms. Lenny actually cycles through all these forms again when messing with Amy.
I'm David.
Oh, wait,
I'm
Benny.
I mean, I'm Lenny. Or is it King? Or is it my favorite?
And all of this is while David convulses, looking very similar to the devil with the yellow eyes in episode 2. And this final sequence in David's home sets the stage for everything we see in the following 2 episodes. As Walter poses as Rudy and shoots at David, David spends time by absorbing all of them into his mind. Fortunately, David isn't in control of that mind. So as the devil with the yellow eyes chases Sid around the hotel room, it gradually grows from white to increasingly red, until they all find themselves in this mental version of Clockworks, where Lenny, the Shadow King, is running the show. And I like this little detail of the ping pong ball sound playing over the final seconds and the closing credits, like the ticking clock of Clockworks repeating over and over as they are stuck inside this loop. And that brings us to the next episode, chapter 6. Lenny questions each of David's companions, trying to weaken them. And notice the people she's most successful at getting under their skin are wearing red under their top layers. First, Melanie, who feels guilty over her sad hope hope about keeping Oliver in cryo-freeze. And then Patanomy, who saw his mother die, which happens while she's listening to the song 99 Luftballons, or in English, 99 Red Balloons. And then Walter, who feels insecurity over his status.
Do I seem like less than a man to you?
Meanwhile, the Carries and Sydney are able to keep the Shadow King out, therefore no Red. And notice how in this reality, Amy is recast as this strict Nurse Ratched type character. That's because the Shadow King is trying to turn all the people who love David against him. Because, as he explains through Lenny later, love is a threat to his power. And he probably realized that this scene with Patanomy is a repeat of David's opening scene with Lenny back in the first episode. Except now, the drooling patient is replaced with Rudy, who's paralyzed down here because he's bleeding from a stab wound on the surface. Another deviation from the real-life Clockworks in episode 1, Sydney wants to eat cherry pie this time. Remember, the real version of her claimed to hate cherry pie.
I don't like orange-flavored things, and I don't like cherry-flavored things.
And another callback, Sydney now hallucinates bugs infesting the pie, just like the strawberries in the previous episode. So, like that place in David's mind, this place is also corrupted by the Shadow King. And the reason only Sydney can see these bugs, as well as the door in the hallway, and why she feels that paranoia that this Clockworks isn't real, whereas all the others accept it, is because of her physiological connection with David from when they swapped bodies. She can perceive the Shadow King, and only she really knows what it feels like when he's manipulating the reality. Now, the first of two amazing songs this episode is a cover of Nina Simone's Feeling Good by Bass Nectar. This whole sequence is awesome, kind of like the opening titles in a Bond film. Lenny dances as this red silhouette as the Shadow King celebrates his victory over taking control of David, kind of a callback to that Bollywood number in the first episode. And throughout this, we see each of the invasive steps that the Shadow King took get brushed onto screen, as if this is part of David's painting. Scoring drugs with David, haunting him in the basement, getting high together, appearing with him in the lab, and showing up in the kitchen during that freakout. And then notice this line from Sydney.
You ever have that feeling like something's happened before, except differently?
Of course, this whole scene is another repeat from that first episode, but reversed, with Sydney wearing the same pajamas that David wore, and David entering the room in the same exact way that Sydney did. And while David acclimates to this mind prison, those not affected by the Shadow King's influence, Sydney and the Carries, dream about the real world. Like Sydney sees David's room with a gunfire, while male Carrie dreams about this.
I personally dreamed of a very large ice cube.
Referring to the one in the astral plane where Oliver lives. Also, notice what female Carrie brings up.
Do you remember that old movie, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea?
Like her male counterpart, she's also referring to Oliver, whom Lenny referred to as Captain Nemo in past episode.
Captain Nemo and his giant ice cube.
Captain Nemo is the main character from the book 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and Oliver walks around in an old-timey diving suit, which we learn later has this name.
May I introduce you to my friend, Jules Verne?
Jules Verne is, of course, the author of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And when Captain Nemo Oliver pulls Carrie into the astral plane, I like how Carrie greets him with several different languages.
Hello, guten Tag, buenos tardes, konnichiwa, kore wa nan desu ka?
This seems like a callback to the first episode, with all those greetings on the wall in different languages. The other little detail that I noticed was Patanomy's memory of his mother's death. The way he's shown under the table, with his grown self dressed as his childhood self, looks like a reference to the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And that film seems like a big inspiration on this show, and Patanomy's power in particular, with characters navigating around memories as if they're physical places, just like Patanomy does. And then the Shadow King Lenny reveals his parasitic nature and his relationship to David's father.
Always acting so holy and then gives away his only son.
Stop.
He thought he could hide you from me, but he was wrong. I found you. Such a sweet little baby.
So not only is the Shadow King confirming the theory about Charles Xavier being his father, he's revealing that his goal is power, to be a god. So it's interesting that he calls David's father, Charles Xavier, a man who acted so holy but then gave away his only son. Now that's a reference to God in the Bible, a holy figure who gave his only son, Jesus, to the world. And as the enemy to that God figure, the Shadow King, Lenny, is casting himself as the devil, probably one with yellow eyes. And this whole concept of a new powerful being trying to take over as God is expressed in this awesome song that closes the episode, Oh You Pretty Things, sung by Lisa Hannigan, originally recorded by David Bowie. I love this song. The lyrics are super deep and philosophical. Bowie's term of homo superior is a reference to another Nietzsche concept, the Übermensch, or it has that umlaut, so like Übermensch? I don't want to have too good of a German accent. Basically, the superior man, a more evolved human being who makes the previous generation redundant and does away with them with his moral superiority. So Bowie imagines this superior man as a crack in the sky, hand reaching down at me. So they sample Bowie's song here to reflect the Shadow King, a superior, evolved mutant being threatening to do away with the old order, whose hand reaches out at us through a crack in the sky. Okay, moving on to chapter 7. Now, the whole point of this episode is to explain in very effective visuals on a blackboard through David's rational British side, using the Socratic method on himself, exactly what is going on. So really, if you're confused, I suggest you rewatch this episode. And since this episode kind of does it itself, there's not a lot for me to explain, but there were a few fun details that I noticed. For starters, I like how these opening images basically say, David, this is your mind on the Shadow King. And they depict that deterioration in the form of clockworks with the red light shining down the hall, red being the color of the Shadow King's dangerous influence, and then once his eyes appear on the walls, the building begins to literally decay into a mess and a riot. This episode also makes a few fun missable references to Charles Xavier, specifically the film version of the character, though I don't think we'll see Patrick Stewart or even James McAvoy appear on this show. When Amy confesses to Shadow King Lenny about David's real father, we see this quick shot of Professor X's wheelchair. And then later, when David puts the pieces together about his father's history with the Shadow King, Dan Stevens actually does a pretty great impression of Patrick Stewart.
Sweetheart, it's over. I won. Give me some sugar.
Is that supposed to be a British accent?
I also like the choice in this episode to use these glasses inside clockworks to know the difference between real threats and mental projections. And since so much color represents so many different things on the show, it's nice to see things in objective black and white. At first, this whole black and white aesthetic reminded me of the film Rashomon. That's Akira Kurosawa's classic story about objectivity and shifting perspectives, kind of like the objectivity that Sydney and the others are finally getting here. But then later, after the Shadow King Lenny transforms this into a silent film, the look of everything also resembles the movie The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. That's a 1920 German expressionist silent film about an insane hypnotist who uses a sleepwalker to commit murders. That plot isn't that far off from the Shadow King's plot, manipulating David for similar violent ends. He even keeps David in this coffin-like box, like how the hypnotist in that movie keeps his sleepwalker in this wooden cabinet. And this is all part of my favorite sequence in this episode, one of my favorites in the whole season, largely because of the music that Oliver's conducting here. This is Maurice Ravel's Bolero. It's a famous orchestral piece that has been used and referenced all over the place. Actually, while filming Rashomon, Akira Kurosawa demanded his composer to make a piece just like Ravel's Bolero. Jeff Russo, who's the composer on Legion, said that his rendition of Bolero, which he called Folero, merged the orchestral elements with synthetic ones, which you can hear as the composition continues. I think that this reflects the transition of the relative peace and order that Oliver tries to bring into this situation to the chaos and panic that the Shadow King unleashes. And by the way, this shield that Oliver attempts to conjure with the song is actually composed of the letters from the word shield. And when the Shadow King Lenny does away with Walter, the look of his body crumbling up is just super unsettling. His limbs contort in a similar way to the guards' bodies look back in Division 3. And real quick, in case you were wondering how exactly they get out of this mess, Rudy surprises the Shadow King Lenny, restraining him at the same moment that David is able to break his mind out of captivity, now that he understands his mind better. That frees the others right as Carrie places the halo on David's head in the astral plane, isolating and trapping the Shadow King and allowing David to regain control over his psychic superpowers to catch the bullets. And yeah, this would seem like a fitting climax to the season, but the Shadow King hasn't hasn't been vanquished yet, and the government interrogator, Clark, has returned. Which brings us finally to the season finale, Chapter 8. The opening images of this final episode are pretty striking, with these blinking color squares similar to the closing credits of every episode. That same maddening image that pops up right when you're asking what the f is going on. And listen to this music. The composer, Russo, said that he rented an antique harpsichord from the 1800s, an instrument that he said he didn't think had ever been used in TV music before. And as this montage follows Clark's recovery after getting burned in the first episode, his appearance kind of resembles two Batman villains. Different superhero universe, I know. But his facial scar tissue looks similar to Two-Face in The Dark Knight, and the way he demands the mirror after the gauze is removed is very similar to Jack Nicholson's Joker in the Batman movie.
Mirror.
Mirror!
And when David confronts Clark, he says this line.
War is over, if you want it.
He's quoting John Lennon and Yoko Ono here. It's the chorus from their Christmas song, Happy Xmas, War is Over, which had a message of social unity and an end to war. So David is proposing a similar peace between the mutants and the human government forces who are trying to kill them. I also liked Clark's reasoning in this episode.
See, now that's a problem, because your babies and my babies, who wins that sandbox squabble?
Clark is right to feel afraid for his children. His logic actually reflects the message of Bowie's Oh You Pretty Thing song, but rather than the mutants fearing the Shadow King as a destructive god that needs to be contained, Clark fears David and the others as the same kind of threat. And notice how the Shadow King Lenny looks so decomposed this episode, with open wounds and pale skin, melting shoes, and flies buzzing around. Kind of like Beetlejuice, honestly. That's because this is Farouk at his weakest state. He's rotting in his captivity inside David's mind. And I mentioned in earlier breakdowns how the music of Pink Floyd was a huge influence on Noah Hawley for this whole show. And I love how this episode uses the opening composition, Breathe, from their landmark album Dark Side of the Moon. Russo referred to this album as the sound of schizophrenia, the sound of mental illness in the 70s. And it's really the perfect music for David seeing his life flash before his eyes as the Shadow King is erased from it. And again, this looks very similar to Eternal Sunshine, when Joel relives his life moments when he tries to have his ex-girlfriend deleted from his memory. And after the Shadow King fights back and threatens to kill David, a man at war with himself, Sydney saves him with this Sleeping Beauty kiss, swapping the demon into her body, who then uses her power to swap into Carrie's body. Then Carrie takes down Ptonomy, Melanie, and Clark, but David is able to knock the Shadow King out of her. Unfortunately, this parasite finds a new host, another psychic with several layers inside his mind, Oliver. And I love how they let Jermaine Clement sing Tony Bennett's If I Ruled the World as he escapes.
If I ruled the world.
With Oliver, the Shadow King is on his way to rule the world. Lenny requests to go someplace warm, suggesting season 2 will change locations from the Pacific Northwest region to someplace further south. We will see. And I don't know if you saw this, but like any good superhero adaptation, Legion has a post-credit scene. He gets sucked into this floating drone orb and taken away from Summerland. My guess is that this belongs to the government forces. Like maybe it's the Equinox that they referred to earlier.
Send the Equinox.
Also, if you look closely, you can see a woman wearing red walking in the background of the scene. And she looks like the same mystery woman that David saw flashes of in episode 2. And we never really got a clear answer of who she is. Also, another mystery that the season never really got to was the Red Hook incident that was brought up in episode 1.
After what happened in Red Hook, I'd say that's an understatement.
So I'm wondering if this woman is connected to Red Hook. Either way, I'm assuming that both of these things will come up in season 2. Okay, I am spent. It is just pudding up here. Those are all the details that I found interesting, but I know I'm gonna have to rewatch these 8 episodes a few times to sort through it all. And thanks so much for your patience with this Legion coverage. Like, I really wanted to do weekly episode breakdowns, but I just had too much on my plate with all the other stuff that we cover on this channel. And if you don't already, you really should check out some of it. It's all good stuff. And let me know what you think in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going until the show comes back. Like, I could talk about this show forever. Let's do it. And if you really like New Rockstars, you can contribute to us on Patreon. Thank you so much to all of our current patrons, especially you, Pony Stark. You can hit me up on Twitter at Erik Voss with any thoughts you have about Legion, or follow New Rockstars on Twitter at New Rockstars for updates on our videos. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.